There are deaths that don't just take a life. They rip apart the peace of an entire community, spreading fear for decades, and only begin to unravel when technology surpasses the limits of its time. But what's even more terrifying is that sometimes the person behind those deaths lives right next to us, wearing the mask of a decent person, going to the market, greeting neighbors every morning as if nothing ever happened. John Getreu was one of those people. February 1973. Leslie Marie Perlov, 21 years old, had just graduated from Stanford University and was working as a legal assistant at a law office in Palo Alto. She was an introverted person, loved reading, enjoyed German literature, and frequently participated in student activities. On the morning of February 13th, Leslie left her office around noon, driving her beige Chevrolet toward the wooded area near Old Page Mill Road. No one saw her after that. The following afternoon, Leslie's car was found parked on the shoulder of a deserted road near the base of the Stanford foothills. The car was locked, the interior neat and tidy, with no signs of a struggle, but Leslie was nowhere to be found. 3 days later, a park ranger patrolling a nearby hill discovered the body of a woman lying face down in the bushes about 90 meters from the car. It was Leslie. Her neck had been tightly strangled with a pink wool scarf, the very same one she had worn when leaving the office. Her face was bruised and lifeless. Her clothing had been torn and her body showed signs of sexual assault. Death had come silently. No screams, no blood, no one heard a thing. At the scene, the investigative team collected every possible piece of evidence. From scraps of fabric, hair, foreign fibers on the victim's clothing to tissue samples from under Leslie's nails. They suspected she had struggled and left behind traces of her attacker, but in 1973, DNA analysis was still a concept unheard of in criminal investigations. The evidence was sealed and placed into storage, waiting for a time when science would be capable of deciphering silence. Leslie had no enemies, did not live recklessly, and had no complex personal relationships. Police could find no motive. A random murder? But why so brutal? And then, a year later, tragedy struck again, this time shaking the entire Stanford University community. On the afternoon of March 24, 1974, Janet Ann Taylor, also 21 years old, and the daughter of Dean E. Taylor, a senior administrator at Stanford University, disappeared while walking home from the library to her house in Menlo Park. Janet loved sports, was healthy, and often walked along the trails at the edge of campus. When she didn't return home, her family immediately reported her missing. The next morning, a cyclist discovered her body on the side of Sand Hill Road, just a few miles from where Leslie had been found. Like Leslie, Janet had also been strangled. Her clothes had also been torn, her body assaulted. Again, no one had seen anything, no screams, no murder weapon left behind. The police no longer believed this was a coincidence. They were dealing with a repeat killer, someone targeting victims with ties to Stanford, strangling them with hands or fabric, and leaving their bodies in secluded wooded areas. The investigators opened the Stanford Strangler Task Force. They analyzed all the common traits. Both victims were female, white, young, intelligent, and often walked alone. Both were murdered within a few kilometers from Stanford. Detectives started reviewing lists of students, school employees, and community volunteers. They questioned known sex offenders, scanned records of criminals in Santa Clara and San Mateo counties. But every name brought up, every file reviewed, yielded no matches. There were no witnesses, no security cameras, still uncommon at the time. DNA wasn't usable. The only pieces of evidence, the scarf, the foreign hairs, the scratches under Leslie's nails, had been rendered powerless by time. The families of Leslie and Janet continually sent letters to police urging them not to let the cases be forgotten. Leslie's mother kept her room intact for years, unable to touch her closet. Janet's father almost never appeared in the media. They lived with a nameless nightmare. The person who killed their daughters was still free, somewhere out there. Many years later, in 2018, when genetic genealogy technology began being used to solve cold cases, a new team from the Santa Mateo County Sheriff's Office decided to reopen the Leslie Perloff case. Leading the effort was Sergeant Dave Boyce, a veteran investigator specializing in unsolved crimes. Boyce sent the original evidence, especially the biological sample found under the victim's nails, to a high-tech forensic lab. This time, instead of comparing it with criminal databases, they matched it with public genealogy platforms like GeneMatch and Family Tree DNA. This was the same technology that cracked the Golden State Killer case in 2018, and now hopes were high it would bring answers for Leslie. A few weeks later, the results started coming in. They identified a genetic branch not matching any known criminal, but connected genealogically to a man named John Arthur Getreu, born in 1944, currently living in Hayward, California. Police immediately launched a reverse investigation. They discovered that John had once volunteered in a public health program at Stanford in the early 1970s. He had access to the campus during the time Leslie and Janet were murdered. He had no criminal record in the U.S., nothing remarkable, lived like a model retiree, which explained why he had never been suspected. To confirm, police began surveilling Getreu. In one instance, he discarded trash, from which officers retrieved a drink can and napkin. DNA analysis revealed a 100% match with the sample from under Leslie's nails. On November 20, 2018, John Getreu was arrested at his home. Neighbors were shocked, his family stunned, but the investigators knew clearly they had found the right man. And from there, John Getreu's true past began to unravel, a past never recorded in American legal files, because it had been buried across the ocean decades earlier when he was still a teenager. And even then, he had already taken a life.
Before killing Leslie Perloff and Janet Taylor in California, John Getreu had already committed another murder when he was only 18 years old in Germany. And it wasn't until nearly 60 years later that the truth came to light. In 1963, John and his family were living in the city of Bad Kreuznach within the American military-controlled zone of West Germany. His father was a high-ranking officer in the U.S. Army. Like many American teenagers there, John attended Frankfurt American High School, a school designated for children of military personnel. He stood out in the crowd, tall, handsome, captain of the wrestling team, active and sociable. But no one knew that behind the model exterior was a controlling, violent mentality with deviant sexual tendencies. On April 26, 1963, the body of Margaret L. Williams, a 15-year-old schoolgirl and John's ex-girlfriend, was found in the woods. She had been strangled with a rope, her clothes disheveled, with signs of sexual assault. Margaret's friends said she had broken up with John because he was controlling and threatening, and that day she had reluctantly agreed to meet him one last time. At the military police station, John admitted to raping and killing Margaret after she refused to reconcile. He said he lost control and didn't mean to kill her. Though the crime shocked the American military community in Germany, the case was not transferred back to the U.S. for civilian prosecution. Instead, John was tried under the U.S. military justice system for American citizens committing crimes abroad. At the end of 1963, he was sentenced to 10 years in a military-run juvenile correctional facility in Germany. But by 1969, after less than 6 years, John was granted clemency for good behavior. He was brought back to the United States with no criminal record in the civilian justice system. No warnings, no supervision, no one paid attention. And so, a man who had killed was released and disappeared entirely from the law's radar. John chose to live in the Bay Area of California. In the 1970s, he held many jobs: lab technician, maintenance worker, salesman. He got married, had children, and volunteered in the community. At one point, he worked for a medical equipment company, then transitioned into in-home elder care, a job requiring patience and trust. He had also participated in a community health support program at Stanford University, the very place where just a few years later, 2 young women would be murdered. Outwardly, John lived like a normal citizen. He had a family, a job, and lived in quiet neighborhoods. Neighbors described him as polite and reserved, often seen walking outside, watering plants, or tending to his yard. He had a good memory, a soft voice, natural communication skills, and was easy to like. Friends said he was knowledgeable about history, passionate about civic organizations, and often helped those around him. But it was all a mask. Inside, the urge to control women and commit sexual violence still simmered. He was not a reformed man, but a predator waiting for another opportunity. In February 1973, the body of Leslie Perloff, a young attorney, was found in Palo Alto. She had been strangled with a silk scarf, showed signs of sexual assault, and her clothes were carefully repositioned as if the killer had tried to hide something. A year later, in March 1974, Janet Taylor, the daughter of Stanford University's dean, was killed in a similar fashion. Body dumped by the roadside, strangled, clothes adjusted. Both cases had no witnesses, no DNA, no leads, and police had no idea that the man who had killed in Germany was living just a few miles away. John Getreu was not a suspect. He continued his life, moved houses several times, worked for small businesses, and even ran a home healthcare company. For nearly 40 decades after, he kept working, paid taxes, and quietly blended into society. He founded local history clubs, participated in community events, and was active in church. Most notably, in 1995, John attended a community meeting in Pleasanton that discussed solutions to domestic violence. In a chilling moment of hypocrisy, he stood before the crowd and spoke about teaching men to respect women and protecting daughters from controlling individuals. No one knew that the man giving that passionate speech had once strangled his ex-girlfriend, raped and murdered at least 2 young women, and still lived as a seemingly model husband and father. Over 40 years later, the murders remained unsolved. But in 2018, technology finally began to catch up to the crimes. When genetic genealogy, a technique that analyzes DNA based on family trees, was introduced into criminal investigations, the Santa Clara County Sheriff's Office decided to re-examine the evidence from the Leslie Perloff crime scene. A sample of DNA collected from underneath the victim's fingernails was sent for comparison. The results traced back through distant family branches to a name: John Arthur Getreu. Police secretly collected DNA from an item he discarded, a plastic cup containing saliva. The test results showed a perfect match. On November 20, 2018, John was arrested at his home in Hayward. The media erupted. Neighbors were stunned. No one could believe the man who took morning walks and watered his lawn had once committed murder. But as police expanded the investigation, they uncovered the 1963 murder in Germany, something no one had ever known. And then they reopened other unsolved files from around the Bay Area in the 1970s. One name stood out: Anita Louise Andrews. On July 15, 1973, Anita, the manager of Jay's Cocktail Lounge in San Mateo, was found dead in her apartment above the bar. She had been raped, struck hard on the head, and strangled to death. The case had no leads at the time, only a small sample of skin cells under her nails. When compared against Getreu's DNA profile, the result was positive. On April 6, 2021, John Getreu was charged with the murder of Anita Andrews. By then, he was over 76 years old, had difficulty walking, but still denied the crime. Prosecutors determined that at least 3 cases, Leslie, Anita, and Janet, shared the same pattern: young female victims, sexually assaulted, strangled, no theft, and left with their clothes neatly arranged. This was no coincidence. These were the acts of a serial killer. However, because there was no DNA sample to compare in Janet Taylor's case, prosecutors lacked sufficient evidence to file charges. Still, with the remaining 2 cases, a life sentence was already inevitable. The painful truth is that for nearly half a century, Getreu lived freely, with a family, a career, and even the appearance of a respectable community member. Meanwhile, the victims' families lived in grief, never knowing who the killer was and never having a chance to speak out.
When the name John Getreu was publicly revealed by the media, many people in the Bay Area were stunned. They weren't just shocked that a serial killer had lived right next to them, but also that he had once been considered an active member of the community, a father, a quiet neighbor, a volunteer in community programs. But all of that was just a mask. What had been hidden for decades was the true nature of a cold-blooded sexual predator who had killed multiple times without leaving a trace. And now, justice had finally caught up to him, but too late for the victims who would never be able to speak again. In September 2021, John Getreu was put on trial in Santa Clara County Court for the murder of Leslie Perlov, a case that had been frozen for more than 4 decades. In court, Leslie's family sat in the front row, holding hands in silence. No one could speak as they watched the man who had killed their daughter, now gray-haired, wearing reading glasses, walking with difficulty, being assisted to the defendant's chair. But they knew well, age does not erase a crime, nor was there any remorse. Throughout the trial, John remained cold, never admitted guilt, and offered no apology. He said he didn't remember. He didn't know why his DNA was on the victim's body. Prosecutors rejected all of those defenses. They presented the jury with matching DNA evidence, witness testimonies, and investigative records spanning years. Notably, they pointed out the similarities across the cases. The method of killing was nearly identical: strangulation, sexual assault, the bodies left with clothing adjusted. This showed the killer had a pattern, a level of preparation, and a clear intent. It couldn't be a coincidence. It couldn't be anyone else but John Getreu. The victim's family was also invited to speak. Leslie's younger sister, through tears, said that for more than 40 years, her family lived in a nameless pain because they didn't know who the killer was, why Leslie had been murdered, and had no answers. She said, "Every time I saw someone who looked familiar, I wondered, could it be him? Could this be the man who took my sister?" That question haunted them through every night's sleep, every conversation, every holiday where Leslie was no longer present. In September 2021, John Getreu was put on trial in Santa Clara County Court for the murder of Leslie Perlov, a case that had been frozen for more than 4 decades. In court, Leslie's family sat in the front row, holding hands in silence. No one could speak as they watched the man who had killed their daughter, now gray-haired, wearing reading glasses, walking with difficulty, being assisted to the defendant's chair. But they knew well, age does not erase a crime, nor was there any remorse. Throughout the trial, John remained cold, never admitted guilt, and offered no apology. He said he didn't remember, he didn't know why his DNA was on the victim's body. Prosecutors rejected all of those defenses. They presented the jury with matching DNA evidence, witness testimonies, and investigative records spanning years. Notably, they pointed out the similarities across the cases. The method of killing was nearly identical: strangulation, sexual assault, the bodies left with clothing adjusted. This showed the killer had a pattern, a level of preparation, and a clear intent. It couldn't be a coincidence. It couldn't be anyone else but John Getreu. The victim's family was also invited to speak. Leslie's younger sister, through tears, said that for more than 40 years, her family lived in a nameless pain because they didn't know who the killer was, why Leslie had been murdered, and had no answers. She said, "Every time I saw someone who looked familiar, I wondered, could it be him? Could this be the man who took my sister?" That question haunted them through every night's sleep, every conversation, every holiday where Leslie was no longer present. In September 2021, John Getreu was put on trial in San Mateo County for the murder of Anita Andrews. Once again, the victim's family came to court, hoping to finally hear a confession, but John still denied it. Still the blank stare, still the evasive answers. The outcome of the second trial was the same as the first. He was sentenced to a second life term, 2 life sentences stacked. No possibility of release. But for the victims' families, that wasn't enough to erase the loss. They said at least now they could tell their children and grandchildren that justice had been served. And at the very least, John Getreu would never be able to harm anyone else again. As for Janet Taylor, the third victim, prosecutors could not bring the case to trial due to the lack of matching DNA evidence, but based on the crime scene details, the pattern of the crimes, and geographic proximity, police affirmed John was the killer. The only thing missing was the technical evidence to present in court. Still, in the eyes of Janet's family, the truth was already clear. They believed that it was this very man, the one who once stood on stage talking about morality, who once shook hands with community activists, who had taken their daughter's life. Throughout the investigation and trial, veteran detectives from Santa Clara and San Mateo counties emphasized, if it hadn't been for genetic genealogy technology, if it hadn't been for the persistence of investigators who never gave up after decades, the killer might have died of old age without anyone knowing. What they had done wasn't just solving a case. It was restoring dignity to the victims and giving answers to those left behind. The John Getreu case once again shows a serial killer doesn't always have a menacing face. He could be a model father, a friendly neighbor, a well-liked coworker. But behind that appearance is a suppressed deviance, something no one noticed until it was too late. The case also sounded the alarm about gaps in the justice system. A man who had once killed could return to the U.S. with no oversight, no criminal record, and continue to commit crimes. John Getreu is no longer alive to face the other crimes he may have committed. He died in September 2023 in a California state prison, just 2 years after being sentenced to life. His death was ruled natural causes, but to many that was still too light an end for someone who had killed at least 3 young women. He died without ever confessing. It's a painful lesson. Justice may be delayed for decades, but it should never be forgotten. And sometimes what's most needed to break the silence is to never give up, to keep investigating, keep asking questions, no matter how much time passes. If you believe this story deserves to be known, please like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video so that more people can see the truth. Let these forgotten cases no longer remain in the shadows, because the truth needs to be spoken, and justice, however late, must be served.